The shy mail-order bride was scared until the rancher's daughter whispered, "Will you be my mama?" Witness this unbelievable, true, inspired story right here on Whisper of the Past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Let's get started. The stagecoach wheels groaned against the rocky Montana trail, each turn sending up a cloud of dust that clung to Clara Whitfield's dress. She sat rigidly on the wooden bench, her gloved hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned pale. The long journey from Boston had felt endless, and now that she was at the edge of it, her chest was heavy with both fear and longing. She had answered an advertisement in a newspaper, one that promised a chance for a new beginning. A widowed rancher, Daniel McGraw, had requested a wife through the agency. Clara's reply had been timid, written late one night after she overheard her cousins whispering cruelly about her being the quiet one who would never marry. That letter had been the first bold thing she had done in her life. Now, as the horses slowed, Clara pressed her face to the window of the coach. Outside stretched miles of rugged prairie, dotted with grazing cattle and framed by the distant shadow of the Rocky Mountains. This was not the world she knew. The cobblestone streets, polished carriages, and tea parlors of Boston were a universe away. Here the sky was wide, the earth rough, and everything felt uncertain. When the coach stopped in front of a large ranch house built from timber and stone, her pulse raced. This was it. This was her new life. The door creaked open, and Clara froze for a heartbeat. Then a man stepped forward. Daniel McGraw. He was taller than she imagined, with broad shoulders, sun-worn skin, and eyes like storm clouds. He wore a wide-brimmed hat in his hand and a shirt rolled at the sleeves, showing arms hardened by work. He did not smile, but there was no cruelty in his gaze either, just caution. Clara's breath caught in her throat as he spoke her name. "Miss Whitfield." Her voice shook as she answered, "Yes, I am Clara." Her feet stumbled on the step as she descended from the stagecoach, her small figure dwarfed by the sheer presence of the man before her. She braced herself for disappointment, perhaps even rejection. Would he think her too plain, too timid, too unfit for the harsh life of the frontier? Before she could gather her thoughts, a small figure darted from behind the rancher. A little girl, perhaps 6 years old, with golden curls that bounced as she ran. She clung to Daniel's leg, peeking curiously at Clara. Clara knelt instinctively, her heart tugged by the child's wide blue eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but the girl leaned close, her voice soft as a prayer. "Can you be Mama?" The world stilled. Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a flicker of a moment, Clara saw the depth of grief in his face. His wife had died 2 winters ago, leaving him to raise their only daughter alone. That single sentence from the little girl pierced every layer of Clara's fear. She felt tears rise in her eyes, and she reached out, gently brushing her fingers against the child's curls. "If you'll have me," Clara whispered back, her voice trembling with tenderness. The rancher shifted his stance, his eyes briefly meeting hers with something unspoken. Gratitude, perhaps, or a glimmer of hope. That first night at the ranch was a blur of emotions. Clara sat at the dinner table across from Daniel, the flickering lantern light casting shadows on the walls. The meal was simple, beans, cornbread, and roasted potatoes, but to Clara it felt like a feast in a strange new land. She barely touched her food, her nerves keeping her stomach knotted. The little girl, Annie, chatted between bites, telling Clara about her pony named Daisy and the creek where she liked to splash her feet. Clara listened intently, nodding and smiling, though her mind drifted constantly to the man sitting across from her. He was quiet, his answers brief, but his watchful eyes missed nothing. She could feel the weight of his responsibility pressing on him. This was not a man who had sought romance. He had sought stability, someone to care for his child, someone to share the burdens of ranch life. When Annie finally grew sleepy, Clara offered to help tuck her into bed. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. As Clara pulled the quilt over the little girl, Annie clasped her hand and whispered, "Don't leave." Clara's throat tightened. "I won't," she promised softly. As she stepped out of the room, Daniel stood in the hallway, his arms crossed. His voice was low, guarded. She's taken to you quick. Too quick, maybe. Just know, I don't expect miracles. She still misses her mother. Clara lowered her eyes. I understand. The days that followed tested every ounce of Clara's courage. Morning began before the sun rose, with roosters crowing and the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. Daniel was already at work by the time she came downstairs, tending to cattle or repairing fences. Clara threw herself into learning her new role. She swept the floors, cooked meals, and sewed torn garments. She helped Annie with her lessons and tried her hand at baking bread, though the first loaf came out so hard that Daniel jokingly suggested using it as a doorstop. For a moment, she thought he might be teasing her, but then his lips almost curved into a smile, and her heart leapt. Life on the ranch was not easy. Clara's hands blistered from scrubbing, and her arms ached from carrying buckets of water. She was unused to the constant labor. Yet every evening, when Annie climbed onto her lap with a storybook, Clara felt a deep warmth settle in her chest. The child's laughter filled the cabin, chasing away the silence that had once lingered there. Still, Clara's fears remained. Daniel was polite but distant, never raising his voice, but never lowering his guard either. Sometimes she caught him watching her as though measuring whether she could withstand the trials of frontier life. She wondered if she would ever truly be more than just a stranger in his home. One evening, after a long day, Clara sat on the porch steps, her gaze fixed on the horizon painted gold by the setting sun. Annie leaned against her shoulder, humming softly. Daniel approached, his boots crunching on the gravel. He stood beside them, silent for a long time. Then almost reluctantly he spoke. She laughed today, he said. Haven't heard her laugh like that since. He trailed off, his voice thick. Clara looked up at him, her eyes gentle. Children need love, that's all. And she has plenty of it to give if someone's there to catch it. For the first time, Daniel met her gaze without looking away. Something shifted between them, a fragile thread of trust stretched across the distance. Clara's heart fluttered. She was no longer just a mail-order bride from Boston. She was becoming part of something larger, something rooted in the land and in the hearts of this small family. That night, Clara lay awake in the narrow bed of the guest room, listening to the sounds of the ranch, the rustle of the wind, the distant call of cattle, the soft creak of the wooden beams. She thought of the letter she had written months ago, the ink smudged by her nervous hand. She had asked for a chance at a new life. Now here it was, raw and uncertain, yet filled with possibility. She was still afraid. Afraid she would fail, afraid she would never measure up to the memory of the woman who came before her. But when she closed her eyes, she remembered Annie's voice, soft and pleading. Can you be Mama? And Clara knew she could try. The days on the ranch turned into weeks, and slowly Clara began to find a rhythm. She no longer flinched when the rooster crowed before dawn. Her hands grew calloused, her back sore, but the sting of labor was less frightening than the emptiness she had known in Boston. Each day tested her, but each night brought small victories. Annie's laughter ringing in the cabin, Daniel's quiet nod of approval when a task was done well, and the sense that this wild frontier land was shaping her into someone braver than she had ever thought possible. Still, there were moments of doubt. Daniel remained a man of few words, and Clara often lay awake, wondering what he truly thought of her. He never raised his voice, never treated her unkindly, but his distance weighed on her heart. She yearned for warmth, for a sign that she was more than just a stranger filling the empty place left by his late wife. Annie adored her, clinging to her skirts, begging for bedtime stories, reaching for her hand, as though Clara had always been there. But Daniel, he was guarded, as if afraid to hope again. One morning, Clara was gathering eggs from the chicken coop when Annie ran to her, eyes wide with excitement. "Papa says you should come to the barn." Clara set down the basket and followed the little girl, her skirts brushing against the dew-wet grass. Inside the barn, Daniel was tightening the saddle on a chestnut mare. He glanced up as she entered. "She's gentle," he said. "Good horse for someone learning." Clara blinked. "For me," he gave a short nod. "You'll need to know how to ride if you're to live here. Can't always depend on the stagecoach. Her heart raced. In Boston, she had never so much as touched a horse. But when Annie clapped her hands and squealed, "You'll ride, Mama Clara," using the name without hesitation, Clara swallowed her fear. With Daniel's steady hand guiding her, she mounted the horse. At first, her body was stiff with panic, but as the mare trotted gently beneath her, she felt a strange sense of freedom. The wide prairie stretched before her, the wind whipping her bonnet ribbons. And for the first time, she realized she belonged to no one's judgment but her own. When she dismounted, breathless and flushed, Daniel's mouth twitched with the ghost of a smile. "You did well," he said simply. Clara's heart soared at those 3 words. The bond between them grew in quiet ways. He began to linger a little longer at supper, listening when she and Annie chatted about the day. Sometimes she caught him watching as she read to his daughter by the fire. His eyes softened with something almost tender. There were still walls between them, but cracks had begun to show, and through them light crept in. Yet ranch life was not without its shadows. One evening, a storm swept across the prairie, lightning flashing and thunder rolling like cannon fire. Clara hurried to shutter the windows, her skirts swishing as she moved from room to room. The wind howled and Annie clung to her side, frightened. Daniel burst through the door, rain dripping from his hat, his shirt soaked through. "Barn roof's giving way," he barked, rushing back into the storm. Without thinking, Clara wrapped a blanket around Annie and ran after him. The rain lashed against her face, the mud sucking at her shoes, but she didn't stop. Inside the barn, Daniel was struggling to tie down loose planks while the horses neighed wildly. Clara grabbed hold of a rope, her hands burning as she pulled with all her might. The storm roared, but together they secured the roof. When it was finally over, they collapsed against a stall, soaked and breathless. Daniel looked at her, water dripping from his hair, his chest heaving. "You didn't need to follow me out here," he said. Clara met his eyes trembling. "I couldn't just stay inside while you fought alone." Something shifted in his gaze then. Not gratitude, not duty, something deeper. For a moment, the storm outside seemed quiet compared to the storm in her chest. Days later, Clara found herself humming while kneading dough in the kitchen. Annie sat at the table coloring with bits of chalk, her curls falling into her face. Daniel entered silently, but Clara sensed him before she saw him. He set down a small bundle on the table. "For you," he said. Clara unwrapped it to find a pair of leather gloves, soft and sturdy, stitched with care. "To save your hands," Daniel explained. "You work hard." "Shouldn't suffer for it," her throat tightened. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it meant more than flowers or jewelry ever could. It meant he saw her, that he noticed her efforts, that he cared enough to ease her burdens. She slipped the gloves on, the leather molding to her fingers, and whispered, "Thank you." The seasons turned and the ranch thrived. Clara learned to churn butter, to patch fences, to ride with confidence across the open land. Annie grew more attached, and soon she refused to go to bed unless Clara tucked her in. Each night, Clara told stories, sometimes from books, sometimes from her own imagination, weaving tales of brave heroines and gentle giants. Annie's laughter filled the cabin, and each time Daniel heard it, his face softened, though he tried to hide it. But shadows of the past lingered. One afternoon, Clara found Daniel sitting alone on the porch, staring into the distance. She sat beside him, the silence stretching between them. At last he spoke. "Her mother was strong, stronger than I'll ever be. She kept this ranch running when I was broken with grief. Then the fever took her." His jaw tightened. "I swore I wouldn't let anyone close again. Too much pain in losing someone you love." Clara's chest ached. She wanted to tell him she understood, that she too had known loneliness and loss, though of a different kind. But instead, she laid her hand gently on his. He didn't pull away. That night, Clara dreamed of a future she had not dared to imagine before. A future where she was not just a mail-order bride, but a wife in truth, a mother, a partner in every sense. The next morning, Annie came running into the kitchen, her face glowing with joy. "Papa says you'll ride into town with us today." Clara's eyes widened. Daniel rarely went into town, and when he did, it was only for supplies. The journey was long, but the atmosphere was lighter than Clara expected. In town, people stared at her, whispering, curious about the new woman at Daniel McGraw's side. She kept her chin high, clutching Annie's hand, pretending not to notice. Daniel's steady presence beside her gave her strength. They bought flour, sugar, tools for the ranch. Then Daniel surprised her by pausing at the general store counter. "Need fabric," he said gruffly. "For Clara." She blinked, startled. He had noticed how threadbare her dresses had become, worn from chores. The shopkeeper laid out bolts of cloth, and Daniel told her to choose what she liked. Clara ran her hand over a soft blue calico and glanced at him uncertainly. He gave the faintest nod. On the way home, Annie fell asleep in the wagon, her head resting in Clara's lap. Daniel glanced at them, his expression unreadable, but his eyes lingered longer than usual. Clara stroked the child's curls, her heart aching with a tenderness she could no longer deny. That night, as the lantern burned low, Daniel stood by the doorway, his voice quiet. "You've brought life back into this house." He hesitated as though weighing every word. "Into her. Into me," Clara's breath caught. The silence between them was charged, heavy with unspoken truths. She wanted to speak, to tell him that she felt the same, that her heart had grown roots here on this ranch, in this family. But before she could, Annie stirred in her sleep, murmuring, "Mama." Daniel's eyes softened, and for the first time since she arrived, Clara felt the distance between them truly break. The shy, mail-order bride, who had once trembled with fear, now stood on the threshold of something greater than she had ever imagined. Not just duty, not just companionship, but love, quiet, steadfast, and as vast as the prairie itself. And though neither spoke the words aloud that night, they both knew this was only the beginning.